Well, welcome everyone. I'm Rick Wilson, the director of Scientia, and I'd like to thank you for virtually attending today's lecture. Well, this year's series is entitled Tradeoffs. Tradeoffs are always with us, whether balancing work and family, self and community, privacy and safety, present needs and future goals. Well, tradeoffs are part of virtually every facet of human life. This year, Scientia looks at the science, philosophy, ethics, economics, and the art of balancing acts that are so much a part of the human condition. Since we decided on this topic, trade-offs have become even more important as we decide how to work around COVID-19. Well, today's speaker knows a great deal about the trade-offs confronting society in general. We're particularly fortunate to have Ed Emmett as our speaker. Ed is a fellow in energy and transportation policy at the Baker Institute. He's a senior fellow at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research and professor in the practice for the School of Social Sciences. His talk is entitled, Enjoy Now or Let Someone Else Have a Better Tomorrow. Ed Emmett graduated from Rice University in 1971 with a bachelor's degree in economics and from the University of Texas at Austin in 1974 with a master's degree in public affairs. He's received numerous awards and honors, including the Distinguished Alumnus of Rice University, the Distinguished Public Service Award from the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, and the Presidential Call to Service Award. Ed was a member of the Texas House of Representatives from 1979 to 1987, during which time he was chair of the Committee on Energy and a member of the Transportation Committee. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush nominated Ed Emmett as a commissioner at the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. After being confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate, which would be a truly rare event these days, Emmett served on the commission for 3 years. He's received international recognition for his work in transportation and logistics policy. He was named Transportation Person of the Year by Transportation Clubs International. Well, many of us know Ed Emmett as the county judge of Harris County from 2007 until 2019. In this position, he was also the director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, a role which established him as a national leader in emergency response and community resilience. He's been in a key position to understand the trade-offs the public faces when confronting natural disasters. Ed has agreed to speak for 35 to 40 minutes and will leave time for questions at the end. You're invited to ask your questions using the Q&A function anytime during the course of the talk. I'll moderate by calling on you and unmuting you so that you can ask your question. If you want me to ask your question, please write it out and I'll try and relay it. Again, please use the Q&A function to queue up for questions. I'll not be paying as much attention to the chat function. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Ed Emmett as our speaker today on Enjoy Now or Let Someone Else Have a Better Tomorrow. Thanks, Ed.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. When I was first approached about talking about trade-offs, lots of things come to mind, but then I was specifically given the assignment of talking about trade-offs in public policy. And that's really good for me, good for you too, because that means I don't have to talk to you about your religious views, your philosophical views, or even share life's lessons about what trade-offs you might have to make. Instead, I just get to talk about public policy and the trade-offs there. And so with that in mind, there were some alternative titles that might have worked. For example, Enjoy Your Life and Let Future Generations Fend for Themselves. That one doesn't sound too good. Or a more academic sounding might be Public Policy, Today's Success versus a Stronger Future. I mean, that sounds like a course that somehow should be taught. But a few comments before I really get started. First, present enjoyment or present success is not always achieved at the expense of a better future. You can have both in some cases. We all wish that was always the case, but it's not true. Secondly, you can't assume that a trade-off in policy is obvious to policymakers, or certainly not to their constituents, their voters, because the trade-offs aren't always easily discerned. But thirdly, I want this to be more of a conversation than a lecture. I know it's billed as a lecture, but conversations tend to work better if you're talking about policy and trade-offs. We don't have many conversations these days in the policy making world. Now, I admit this is going to be kind of a one-sided conversation until, Rick lets some of you ask questions and we talk. But if you think about it in terms more of a dinner table conversation, or maybe over drinks or something, I think it'll go better. And if you think about other conversations that have occurred, as I went down that path, I realized there have been some great conversations I wish I'd been part of talking about policy. One of my favorites would have been President Ronald Reagan sitting down having something stronger than a Diet Coke with Tip O'Neill when he was Speaker. They got together at the White House regularly and they talked about things. None of those are recorded. There aren't any records. But don't you know that those were great conversations about policy? Or at the state level, when George W. Bush was governor of Texas, there was a crusty gentleman by the name of Bob Bullock who was lieutenant governor, longtime Democrat activist, George W. Bush, Republican governor, and reportedly they got along famously and they got together frequently to, again, have conversations. And here locally, I'm going to try not to bring my own personal into this very much, but whether it was Mayor Bill White or Mayor Anise Parker or Mayor Sylvester Turner, I had countless conversations with those people before either one of us would go out in the public and say this or that, or decide we're going to mandate this or that. We'd talk about it. And those conversations, they didn't always go perfectly well, but they were a sharing of ideas. And that's the way we really need to think about policy. And it's certainly the way we need to think about policy in terms of its impact on the future. Now, to paraphrase Secretary James A. Baker, one thing is clear. In order to engage in policy, you first have to engage in politics. That's not always clean. It's not always neat. And when it comes to trade-offs, it presents a real problem. Because what is success in politics? It's pleasing voters. And voters don't always want to be told, well, this is going to be good for you 20 years from now. They want you to do something now. And so politics engaged, it's not always best for the future. I'll just leave it as that. And sometimes the trade-off isn't obvious, either to the policymaker or to the public. So with that in mind, let's talk about some examples of policies. Pardon my hand here. I'm trying to get to where I can see things without looking down too much. Some examples of trade-offs in policies. What's the most obvious one? Where you give up something now in order to have a better future. Most people would say war, no question about it. You actually send people off to die for the benefit of those that are going to come in the future. Most obvious example of that's the American Revolution. George Washington, a lot of the leaders of the American Revolution, they could have lived a very comfortable life. They didn't have to risk everything in order to try and form this nation that we now live in, but they did. More recently, think about World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All through the 30s, the United States did not want to get involved in another war. And I've got the book where the correspondence between President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill. And the conversation, it was obvious that President Roosevelt knew what he was doing, but he also knew the public wasn't going to stand for us getting involved. So in 1940, he runs for re-election. He runs on, I'm going to keep us out of the war. But he knew full well that wasn't the right thing to do. And he had to bring the country along. So the policy, you had to convince people they had to give up some comfort. And boy, did that generation give up a lot of comfort. And of course, you can't talk about war without talking about the Civil War in the United States, where hundreds of thousands died for freedom, for others. And the truth is, and we're still, frankly, suffering through a lot of that history right now. But here in Texas, there was one person who stood out, who literally just gave up everything. And that was Sam Houston. He was governor, but he wouldn't sign the secession order. So he was run out of the governor's office almost literally at gunpoint and died thinking he had been a failure because he wanted the future to be better and he wasn't willing to just live comfortably as governor of Texas as part of the Confederate States of America. So those are the big dramatic, but we have others. What about societal policies? I think the one that's most impressive is public education. People were asked early on, give of your resources to provide education for others. You don't have many people, you have a few still, I guess, but you don't have many people who say, why should I be paying for public education? I don't even have any children. Well, because everybody knew it was the right thing to do and it was going to make for a better future for everybody. And of course, now that I'm of that age, have to talk about Social Security a little bit. Again, a program that was put in place to guarantee a future, but you had to give up something in the present. And one of my favorites, Lyndon Baines Johnson, if you listen to his tapes, he knew the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the right thing to do. But he states unequivocally, he knows it is going to kill his political party in the South for years to come. Because as I have to remind students, back in the 1960s, the parties weren't quite what they are now, and they're constantly evolving. And the Southern Democrats were, in fact, the George Wallaces of the world and the Lester Maddexes of the world. And all those people were going to not be happy about civil rights. But does anybody today think the Civil Rights Act wasn't the right thing to do, even though it caused great personal political damage to some people that President Johnson was close to? No question. On an economic front, I have the privilege of teaching a transportation economics course here. And my favorite example to talk about all the time is the building of the Interstate Highways, the largest infrastructure project in United States history. But people forget there was already a highway system in place. There was a U.S. highway system. We romanticized Route 66 going all the way across the country. You could drive north, south, east, west. You could go anywhere in the United States. And yet President Eisenhower was really pushing the idea, mainly for military purposes, or so that was the official story. And he was pushing the idea of building new interstate highways. But there were some real losers in that process. All you have to do, maybe most of them are gone now, but you could drive on the old U.S. highway system and you could see the cafes and the motels and the gas stations, all of which were put out of business by the decision to build an interstate highway system. But the decision to build that interstate highway system is what allowed the United States economically to boom later on, because the ability to move people and goods much more efficiently is one of the greatest features of our country. And then talking about transportation, whether you're talking about taxes, tolls, infrastructure, regulations that were put in place. All those things were done with an eye to the future, but sometimes we didn't guess right. Regulations tended to protect the status quo. I remember, and not many people do, but I remember when in the state of Texas, UPS was not allowed to ship point to point within the state of Texas. That was a policy that was set by the Texas Railroad Commission. And once that changed, a lot of trucking firms went out of business. You don't hear about Merchants Fast Motor Freight or Central Freight Lines anymore, but we're better off because of it. And so, yeah, there was some short-term pain, but there was long-term gain. And locally, we have local examples, all over the state. My favorite, Jefferson, Texas. Back in the years after the Civil War, Jefferson, Texas was the second largest cotton port in Texas behind Galveston. It's on a tributary of the Red River. It's up in East Texas. It's now a nice little bed and breakfast place you can go visit. But at the time, the town fathers, and I apologize to all the women in the audience, but that's who ran the town. They owned all the docks and the wharves and the steamships that plied those waters. And Jay Gould came to town and wanted to bring a railroad there. We didn't have railroads much in Texas at that time. They said, well, why would we do that? We're making all this money. We're a wealthy cotton port. We have absolutely no interest in bringing competition to our town. So the story goes, Mr. Gould took his railroad and he went somewhere else. Went to a little village that had no reason to exist. It wasn't really of any note, a little village called Dallas. And Dallas is today what it is, largely because of the decision made by Jefferson, Texas. By the way, there's a corollary to this story. Once Jefferson, Texas realized that maybe it had made a mistake, it contracted with the U.S. Army. It was before the Army Corps of Engineers was actually formally created. And they wanted to remove a log jam that was in that part of the Red River. So Army came in, they blew up the log jam, and guess what? The water level dropped. Steamships could no longer even get to Jefferson, Texas. And it went from being the second largest cotton port, making a bad decision, to being no port at all. All because they decided it was better to hang on to what they had and live comfortably rather than, going with a new technology. Let's talk about Houston. Let's talk about Harris County. Look at the highway system that we have. There are arguments right now about where a highway should go, eminent domain, which neighborhood's going to be disrupted. But when I moved here in 1966, Loop 610 wasn't in yet. The feeder roads were. And if you look, Loop 610 on the west side went right through the middle of Bel Air, Texas. I'm sure that was a tough decision. People that lived there probably weren't happy about having their houses taken. And the ones that are now, or at that point were put immediately adjacent to what was going to be a freeway, probably weren't happy either. And I remember there was a house or two that stayed literally in the middle of where the freeway was going to be built while the access roads went on both sides. They were the holdouts. There was a holdout when Greenway Plaza was built. And if you look at the old pictures of downtown Houston, you can see that all over. Any type of improvement for the future caused pain for somebody in the present. But never did we really look at the pain as much as we did during Harvey. Harvey was not a hurricane. I have to remind people of that all the time. People say, oh, we got hit by Hurricane Harvey. No, we got hit by the rains that were the remnant of Hurricane Harvey. But it exposed a real flaw in the way that we developed as a community. Development had occurred inexplicably in places that, looking back, you could say they were going to flood. And the best way to describe it, if we remember Tropical Storm Allison, the Rice campus, where I sit right now, this area went underwater. The Texas Medical Center went underwater. And people said, well, why did that happen? That hadn't happened before. Well, if you went back and looked at the original maps of this area, there was a big creek that ran right through the middle of Rice campus and right over to the Texas Medical Center. And we built on top of it. And when the waters got high enough, Mother Nature has a long memory, and waters went back to their natural path. Well, a lot of corrections were made, Kirby Drive improvements were made, Braze Bio improvements, and that's been corrected. But nobody really picked up on the fact that if you look at the way development occurred in Houston and Harris County to the west, we did the same thing out there without really knowing it. And the Addicks and Barker reservoirs were built in the 1940s to prevent downtown Houston from flooding. Good decision. It was future oriented. But decisions after that were not future oriented, because when the Addicks and Barker reservoirs were built, they were almost 20 miles out of town. Nobody was ever going to live there. But through the years, we quit paying attention. And if you look at all the villages, everything that got built out Buffalo Bayou, all the way to literally to Addicks and Barker reservoirs, those were short-term decisions. We're going to build here because it's a lovely area. And when they built on that area, nobody kept track of where all the tributaries were going into Buffalo Bayou. So nobody knew exactly where the floodplains were. And in the most bizarre decision ever, people were actually allowed to build behind the dams of the reservoir, so that you were building in the floodplain of the reservoir itself. So then when Harvey came, the reservoir filled up, those people flooded. But even more interesting was the core decision, and I'm not going to get into the legalities of it, but when they opened the floodgates, they did that because the floodwaters were beginning to go around the north side of the reservoir, and nobody knew where the floodwaters were going to go. That's called building for now without paying attention to the future. Now we know that. And the sad thing is, we had actually had a policy decision earlier that paid great dividends. When I was first elected to the legislature in 1978, subdivision in Baytown known as Brownwood, very fancy subdivision where a lot of the Humble Oil and later Exxon executives lived. It was just sinking into the bay. And people went, well, why is it sinking into the bay? Well, that's when we really got to know subsidence well. And a policy was created to stop pumping groundwater in Harris and Galveston County, because by pumping groundwater, we were causing subsidence and we were flooding people. So a decision was made to give up something, namely groundwater, in exchange for having a better future. We didn't do that when it came to development and understanding where tributaries were. Well, now that gets us to COVID. Nobody could have seen this coming. Well, actually, one person did see this coming. We didn't do enough about it, but when I first came in as county judge, public health director for Harris County was a woman named Herminia Palacio. She went on to be deputy mayor of New York City, in charge of their public health. And this gets into politics a little bit, and I apologize, but it shows how policies get made. 2008 election was coming up. And if you remember, what was the hot issue at that time? Well, immigration was beginning to come up. And, you know, as a native Texan, it wasn't a great surprise to me, but other people were going, you know, there are folks in this country that didn't come here legally. And as a Texan, you almost want to laugh because you say, yeah, it's kind of been this unspoken thing for years. And the political, I won't say gurus, but the folks that really push political campaigns were adamant. Oh, you've got to take a hard stand against allowing people who aren't in this country legally to draw down public services. And of course, the public service that's most used is public health, the Harris County Hospital District. And so I asked Dr. Palacio, I said, okay, talk to me about this. And she said, well, actually, you don't have a choice. She said, federal law requires anybody that shows up at an emergency room has to be treated. Doctors take an oath to make people better. But then she hit the zinger that I've remembered so often during this COVID. She said, but more important, Judge, you have to make sure that a pandemic doesn't break out in this community. So therefore, you need to make sure everybody gets as good a health treatment as they can. It's always stuck with me. Did we do enough with it? No. Because frankly, pandemic, that's one of those words you think about, but you don't necessarily think it's going to come to you. When the pandemic was already appearing in other parts, you know, we had a state representative take people out to eat down in Southwest Houston just to say, no, we're open for business. Wrong reaction. I wouldn't have reacted any faster. I'm not being critical about that. Nobody could see it coming. But the pandemic shows that the policy, at least we put in place to make sure everybody had access and to involve the federally qualified health clinics, the FQHCs, was a good one. If we had a lot of people who didn't have any access, we would be in a world of hurt. But the COVID crisis that we're going through right now is short-term and not just long-term, but medium-term. And the policy decisions that have to be made, how do you weigh the health risk versus the economic damage? And then how do you weigh both of those against the societal damage? You have children out of school, but some of those children are better able to handle virtual learning than others. You know, my grandchildren, their parents are really good at being able to get them on devices and help them teach and all that. But that's not true of everybody in the community. So there is a decision to be made there, and it requires conversation rather than mandates. And I don't think enough conversation's going on. Everybody says we're going to listen to science, but then they don't really listen to the science they say they're going to listen to, and they don't actually follow it. You know, I've wanted to ask questions about grocery store workers. They've been required to go to work. Well, what's their positivity rate? How many are getting sick? What numbers can we actually glean from the experience that we're having? We spend a lot of time talking about bars and restaurants, but what about the people who are having to go out there and work all the time? Here at Rice, you know, it was a pretty big debate. Do we open the campus? Do we not? I have to say, Rice has done a splendid job. Rice got all kinds of attaboys on NBC Nightly News, what was it, a couple nights ago. The positivity rate is infinitesmal for all the people that are being tested, the thousands. It's a single digits number. So that's true at Rice, but what about public schools? Because public schools have a lot to do with our future. Hate to say it, probably more so than Rice in the long term. So those are some of the examples of the past and the present. But now let's generate a little controversy. What are some of the future trade-offs we're going to have to talk about? Future trade-offs in policy. Most obvious one, the environment. What are we willing to give up in order to make sure that generations to come have a better environment than we have? And it's not anything new. I mean, let me give you an example it's kind of mundane, but we have limits on hunting and fishing. You know, there are catch limits on fish, and there are bag limits for people that hunt. Somebody made a policy decision years ago that that was worth doing, that future generations should be able to hunt and fish. And the only way to do that was to put limits on it. Well, if we're willing to do that for hunting and fishing, shouldn't we be willing to do that somehow when it comes to talking about the environment? We did it with subsidence. We said, no, even though you own the groundwater, you can't pump it. You can't use it yourself. You have to use surface water. We've done it with water quality. We've done it to an extent with air quality. We didn't do it with development. Obviously, that's been corrected. You know, Harris County and City of Houston all have much more stringent standards now, but I don't think they're stringent enough. We still haven't dedicated the Katy Prairie to just a preservation area and left it wild and in a natural state. You know, we now have a cabin up in East Texas, and I get to walk through some very small remnants of the big thicket. And I think, well, what if we'd had a policy that protected the big thicket? That would never happen, because the big thicket not only was completely spoiled because of timber, but then they discovered oil under the big thicket. And that was, so at that time, the decision was made to benefit for that day. So we don't have a big thicket. Okay, I guess I can live with that. But what are we willing to give up to make sure that we have an environment? Give you an example. You heard that I was appointed to the Interstate Commerce Commission. The first year I lived up there, commuted back and forth, but I got rid of my car because DC had a metro system that worked just fine. It wasn't worth the expense of maintaining a car. And so I was willing to do that. If you ask me today to give up my car in Houston, Texas, would I do that? No. But should we design a system that would get more people to agree to give up a car? Probably so. So the environment's the most obvious future policy decision we have to make. But I want to talk about three more. Number two is China. Do we allow ourselves to become dependent upon China? And where's that going to lead us in the long-term future? But what does it mean to, and I'm not saying declare war or anything like that, but what does it mean to give up China a little bit? Well, look at everything you buy. I'm in the process of compiling a whole list of things that are in our daily lives, and how many of them are made in China. And long term, is that good for us? And not only in terms of us becoming dependent, but are we enabling China in their global reach by providing them with so many financial resources? It's a policy decision we've got to talk about. Third, Teddy Roosevelt was known as the trust buster. You know, what trust did he bust up? Standard Oil, groups like that, Big Steel. Are we facing the same thing today with Amazon, Google, Facebook, and other dominant companies? I think a lot of people would say yes. And do we put a policy in place now that maybe restricts us a little bit, maybe hampers our ability to enjoy life a little bit in order to make sure that we're not captive later on and we have problems later on. So an example of that, when I was growing up, utilities were heavily regulated, but utilities are deregulated now. I'm not sure everybody understands how to pick an electric supplier or what all the various stages are, but it's worked. And talking about deregulation, since I mentioned the transportation economics class I teach, it's fascinating to go back and look at the airlines, the railroads, the trucking firms, the shipping lines. They were all heavily regulated, but they were regulated in order to supposedly protect the public. But after a few years, or maybe even a few decades, the regulations weren't there to protect the public anymore. They were there to protect the industry. And deregulation is what allowed newcomers to come into those industries and to flourish. And a total side note, I delight in asking the students, by the way, who was the president and who was the lead senator that pushed the deregulation? None of them ever get it right because they view things through today's lens. And maybe they'll guess Ronald Reagan, but the truth is it was President Jimmy Carter and it was Senator Ted Kennedy that were the big deregulators in the 1970s. We need to remember those kind of things because that gets back to that conversation idea. Right now, if you say deregulation, you think conservative Republican. No, not necessarily. Let's talk about it and see what's good for everybody. And then the fourth one, I admitted that these are all going to create some controversy. Social programs. I mentioned LBJ earlier, back in the 60s. I think if President Johnson were alive today, he would be the first to say, I didn't mean for some of those programs to be in effect for 50 years. They were supposed to be bridges. They were supposed to be a way of getting people out of their circumstance into a better future. But now look at housing programs, anti-poverty programs, even some of the healthcare programs. Have they accomplished their purpose of moving people out of circumstances, or are we running the danger of creating a permanent underclass? And we're seeing more and more disparity between the very wealthy and the very poor in this country. And are our policies, do they make sense anymore? Are we really doing the right thing? And this is where politics gets back into it, because if you represent a district where a lot of the constituents rely on these policies, rely on these programs, they're not going to want you to change them. They're comfortable with what they have without realizing that there could be a much better future if they're willing to give up that program that's been in effect for so long. Two thoughts, and then I'll close and take questions. Two theories that I espouse a lot in my class. One is creative destruction. Every time you have a new technology, it pretty much puts some old technology out of business. New policies need to replace old policies. If we don't have that creative destruction, then we get stuck. And we're going to look up and the future is not going to be as bright as it could be. The other one is unintended consequences. In the transportation world, we now see the ubiquitous containers all over on trucks and on trains and on ships. But the man who really pushed the containerization, Malcolm McLean, did it because he owned a trucking firm and he wanted to move containers from North Carolina to New York and back more efficiently. It wasn't his intent. He certainly didn't ever see that all of global commerce was going to change, but that was an unintended consequence that was good. Locally, I'll give you an unintended consequence that was good in one way, but bad in another. Nobody can disagree that desegregation was the right thing. We're glad our community desegregated. we remember redlining and the fact that realtors would only show houses to certain people in certain areas. But if you look at the impact on Houston's Fifth Ward, when desegregation came along, the middle class, the business owners moved because they could for the first time. They could take their children and put them in different schools. And by losing that component of the Fifth Ward, then the Fifth Ward began to decline when it used to be a very vibrant business center for the African American community. And that's an unintended consequence. So anytime we talk about policies, we have to look at their impact today, and if we can, try and look at the impact for the future. But the only way to do that is to have a conversation. The only way to do that is to sit with people who may not agree with us and say, okay, what do you see in this? And have that kind of conversation. So that's why I was anxious to do this today. Anytime you talk about trade-offs, every decision we make is probably going to involve a trade-off of one kind or another. But when it comes to policy and you add the politics into it, it makes it that much more intriguing, shall we say. So Rick, with that, I don't know if we have any questions generated. I will say, let me hasten to add, I say this a lot, we're in presidential times. I tend to treat Q&A sessions like presidential debates. You can ask any question you want, but I'll probably answer the one I wanted you to ask. If I do that to you, just sort of drag me back and say, no, you got to answer the question. So Rick, back over to you.
Great, Ed. Thank you very much. We have several questions. I'll have people ask them themselves in most instances. But before we get going, let me ask the first question, which is, you talk about the importance of conversation primarily between political elites, I guess, at least people who are, policymakers. But the question, is that we know elected officials are always under the gun. They're tugged by short-term interests, that is making their constituents happy, and often are led to ignore the long-term effects of I guess appealing to voters in the short run. So how do elected officials balance that out? I think it's a really difficult balance, and so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
No, it's beastly difficult for an elected official if the elected official's goal in life is to just stay in office. But there are, John F. Kennedy wrote Profiles in Courage. There are those times where you have to make a decision and say, look, it's the best decision. And, I'll go back to Sam Houston. He knew that the right thing to do was for Texas not to secede, and he knew it wasn't going to end well. But he was willing to give up the governorship to stick to his principles. And I think you see more people in politics do that than you're even aware of. And they end up, I told you I was going to answer a question I wanted to ask. One of the biggest problems we have right now is both parties have gone to the fringe. And so the constituents they try to keep happy are the more extreme elements of the two parties. That wouldn't have, George W. Bush and Bob Bullock sitting down didn't worry about those things. But in today's world, that's the decision that so many make. And when they make the wrong decision, they get beat in the primary. And that's unfortunate.
Okay, our next question is from Moshe Vardi. He's going to ask it himself.
Hey, Ed, great talk.
Thanks, Moshe.
An aspect that you did not mention is this tension between markets and governments, right? So markets tend to optimize typically for the short term. and it usually required government actions to look in the long term. And this goes into actually part of the philosophical differences between the two parties, which is how much to intervene in the marketplace.
No, there's no question that that's part of the case. And given my own background, if you look at again transportation economics, that was a lot of what was driving the regulatory regime. The markets in that case wanted to protect the current vested interest, and the idea that you were going to overturn those markets and, for example, allow UPS to come into the state of Texas, knowing full well that there were trucking firms that were going to be put out of business. That's why the legislature didn't want to do it. But sometimes you just have to take those stands. And by the way, it took 3 sessions of the legislature to get that bill passed.
Let me ask a question that somebody else in the audience has asked. And it's a general question about how do you think we can alter social problems to help lift people out of poverty? It's kind of a big question.
Well, it's one that I sort of addressed. We have to be willing to admit that some of the programs we have aren't working as intended. You know, I mentioned housing. Public housing was originally designed to give people a bridge to a better life. Unfortunately, too many people now seem to be stuck. That's not good for them. It's not good for us, and it's not good for the future. So you've got to be willing to look at some of these programs and say, okay, there are better ways of doing this. I'll give you an example that in recent years has become big, and I think it will become bigger, and that is the whole question of law enforcement and mental health. Recognizing that on any given night, roughly a third of the people in Harris County Jail have some kind of mental health condition. They don't belong in the criminal justice system. They belong in the mental health system. But our programs aren't funded in such a way to do that. And the legislature and other parts of the country are moving that way, but not rapidly enough. And so we have to keep looking at better ways of dealing with people.
The musical Hamilton, so that discussions of trade-offs have genuine input from the communities most impacted.
Well, everybody tries to do that. And unfortunately, you can end up with just a cacophony of sound if you don't do it carefully. You know, you can't turn it into sort of mob rule. So how do you find the voices that are representative of those who are not in the room? Let me go back to mental health for a minute. I remember, must have been 2010 maybe, then Sheriff Adrian Garcia and I were at a gathering of 25 or 30 people sitting around a big table talking about mental health. He was the only Latino there, and there may have been one African American. And there was nobody from the Indo-American community, nobody from the Pakistani community, the Sikh community. And so I looked at Adrian and I said, what's wrong with this picture? And how do you get people involved? And I use mental health all the time because it's sort of my passion, but a lot of groups don't want to engage because they don't want to admit that they are part of the problem. But we just have to keep working on it.
Okay, so let me skip on to somebody else. William Sayer asked the following question: how well do you believe the current presidential administration is preparing us for the long term? That could take you a while to answer.
I was going to say, I'm going to try and stay out of partisan politics, but you know, if you're asking me to get into the mind of President Trump, I can't do that. I have my limitations. And I will say though, as a kind of a political wonk and a policy junkie, one of the big issues has been the constant turnover, people coming into and out of the administration, and what's the clear focus. And I don't think there has been a clear focus. At the same time, I think there's been so much distraction coming from the other side. We saw a lot of this with President Obama too. Just to be clear, if the purpose of the out of power party from day one is to punish and make look bad the person that's in the White House, that's not going to lead to a good long-term vision. And I saw Republicans do it to President Obama, and I'm seeing people do it to President Trump. And I really hope, and read into this what you will, I really hope after November, the country can do a reboot and say, okay, we've endured X number of years. Let's figure out how we can all get back together.
Okay, John Michael Austin asks, what future versus now policy questions do you foresee coming up in the legislative session this year? I'm not sure if that's the Texas legislature or the federal.
He works for Representative Oliver, so I know where he's coming
from.
Yeah. Okay, this is going to sound a little harsh. I'm sorry. We have a pendulum. When I went to the Texas House, there were 24 Republicans and 126 Democrats. And I had people tell me, the Republicans are never going to be in charge. But from 94 on, Republicans have been in charge. But a lot of those Republicans have been running against the government for all those years. And when you've been in charge of a government for a quarter of a century, you can't keep running against it. You own it. And so whether you're talking about healthcare or taxes or infrastructure, I think the legislature this time is going to be evenly divided. It doesn't really matter whether it's, a few one-way Republican, one-way Democrat in the House. The Senate's still going to be Republican. Lieutenant Governor Patrick's going to still be Lieutenant Governor. But they're going to have to address the financial issues that the state is facing. And they're going to have to address things like Medicaid expansion or whatever the latest healthcare opportunity is. I remind people all the time, Indiana engaged in Medicaid expansion, and who was the governor at the time? It was Mike Pence. So the legislature is going to have to look up and say, okay, this state is now pretty purple, and we're no longer playing to the base. We got to figure out what to do long term.
Sorry, I got sidetracked here. So another question, this is by Catherine Hayes, says you've talked a lot about the trade-offs between economic policy and environmental policy. What are your thoughts on the U.S. backing out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and what trade-offs could be made in terms of our economy and our environment? And this is also a very tough question.
Well, it sort of is a tough question, but not really. The Paris Accord, we can do things on our own, but I think it's more the perception. I think if we tell the world we don't want to be in the Paris Accord, but we agree that climate change is real, that's the troublesome thing to me. If we argue that climate change isn't occurring, well, let me take you to Glacier National Park. Let me show you the satellite photos of the polar caps. I mean, you can't make that argument. And so it makes us not a player on the world stage, whether or not we're in the Paris Accord. It's more all the other stuff that's being said that just says, yeah, we want to deny reality, and you can't do that.
Okay, there's a couple of questions that relate to what has changed over time in maybe in the United States that has reduced, I guess what I would say, bipartisanship. And one of the questions has to do with, do you see any change in redistricting processes as leading to less polarized politics? Or the other variant on that is what kinds of sacrifices other generations made. You talked about the World War II generation. And what will it take to get people today to make those same kinds of sacrifices? So I think both of those questions deal with what has changed in the U.S. and how can we get back to bipartisan.
Well, interestingly enough, it's
politics.
going to tie a little bit to the redistricting. We now have districts that defy any logic. They squiggle around, to get this community and that community. And if the courts would ever enforce the compact and contiguous nature of districts, we'd be a lot better off. In Harris County, the county commissioner precincts make no sense. What do county commissioners do? They do roads and parks and things like that. That should be a geographical precinct. And what you should do is cut the county into 4 quadrants and just wiggle the lines for population and forget about trying to draw a line to elect a particular person. But as long as we have computers that can tell you the outcome of an election, if you draw the district a certain way, that's going to be a problem. Personally, I think having a nonpartisan redistricting commission is always a good idea. And the party out of power always thinks that's a great idea, and the party in power never thinks it's a good idea. But until we get to districts that are more geographical than they are based on partisan politics, we're not going to get there, because the vast majority of legislative districts in Harris County are all going to be either a Democrat or Republican. Now, lately, Harris County's been changing a little, but I can guarantee you after they redraw them, they'll all go back to being one or the other. And that means that the candidates they worry about their primary more than anything else. And that's the other thing that will help. If everybody will start voting in the primaries, it will help. People find it hard to believe, but years ago, back I think as late as the 70s, more people would vote in a Democratic primary in Texas than voted in the general election, because that's where the election was made. It was conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats. Well, we need to not get back to that system, but we need to get back to a system where people participate in the primaries, and we can get some more, frankly, centrist candidates running for office.
We have time for one last question here. And the question is, what major current trade-off would you personally like to see for both our country, our county, and our city to engage in to make our life better?
Country, county.
There's 3 different levels, right?
Yeah, I'd have to think about that for quite a while. But I do think at the national level, I almost wish we had a sunset process like we have in Texas, where programs are examined and we go back and we look, because right now the federal budget is eaten up with entitlements and military. And so even if you want to do something different, you can't. So I think at the federal level, that's what I would do. At the state level, I think there needs to be a clear acknowledgement that we want to look to the future. Right now, too many people are saying, well, we're going to protect, Texas is great and we're going to protect it the way it is. Well, the world's going to pass you by if you do that. And here locally, this is a little bit wonkish, but I've got to say it. Harris County is unique. You've got over 2 million people who live in unincorporated Harris County. And the city of Houston is just barely larger than that. And probably by the time the census report comes, you're going to find that more people live in unincorporated Harris County than live in the city. And the county government doesn't even have ordinance making power. Somehow we've got to find a way for the city of Houston and the 33 other cities in Harris County and the county to combine resources and find a different way of providing services. Because on a simple level, we used to talk about the animal shelter. Mayor Parker and I, Mayor Turner and I, you know, a stray dog doesn't care whether it's in the city of Houston or in unincorporated Harris County, but yet who gets called depends on where the dog is. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And likewise, whether you're talking about the health systems, the public health system, everything. So we're going to need a unique approach to the urban environment that we call Harris County and the city of Houston.
Well, great. I want to thank you very much for your time and your thoughtful discussion, and certainly for all the questions you raised. Some of them will not be answered in my lifetime, I suspect, but nonetheless, they're important things for us all to consider as we make trade-offs in this political life that we have, I guess. So thank you very much, Ed. I really appreciate your time. And what I want to do is remind everybody in the audience that on Tuesday, November 17th, we're going to have Sylvia D. and Pedram Hassanzada talking on trade-offs, the climate change, trade-offs between people and planet. So this should dovetail nicely with some of the issues that you brought up today, Ed. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank the audience for your patience and your questions. And I look forward to seeing you all in a month or so. Again, thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.